comment actually on one of the other questions which you posed related to the resolution 2178 on foreign terrorist fighters. That resolution now is exactly 2 years old. It was released in September 2015, and NRC actually supported the Harvard Program for International Law and Armed Conflict to do a study 1 year afterwards. Sorry, 2014, 1 year afterwards, to look at if there was any impact of the implementation of that resolution by member states on humanitarian action. Now, it was a kind of an early study because it was done 1 year afterwards, so it was still evolving. And though that resolution does have a provision for IHL and human rights law, what we actually do find and do see more and more, but it's still quite early, is an impact, particularly in terms of travel restrictions for people around the world, for people who are providing humanitarian support in areas of armed conflicts, that it is increasingly difficult to travel to those areas as a result of the evolution of that resolution. And also more administrative procedures and restricted access to finances, although the restricted access to financial services is something we see as a result of a lot of counterterrorism measures. When we looked at this, we didn't just want to point out all the problems and then point fingers. It's much more important to focus on how we address this. And so from our point of view in NRC, we've worked alongside a lot of partners and organizations to do a risk management assessment. So basically, to look at identifying and providing risk management tools which can help organizations, hopefully, to do risk analysis of their operations, to identify the risks, and then put in place tools adapted to that particular context, which can hopefully mitigate the risk of diversion, for example, diversion of aid. Now, these are risk management tools that would also work for diverting aid, for preventing risk of diversion in corrupt circumstances, but also definitely serve in terms of mitigating the risk of diverting aid to terrorist groups. Now, these are just basic good practices, but this environment has basically led us to really put risk management and development of risk management tools in the context of counterterrorism measures to ensure that we can preserve humanitarian action. We also, in line with that at the same time, we have done and continue to try and do a lot of work around raising awareness of this issue. Like I said before, sometimes it's not just a case of organizations don't know what the risk is. Organizations sometimes, and especially if you're talking about small local organizations, aren't always aware of what questions to ask. So we've gone to a lot of these countries I've mentioned to have discussions with actors to really break this subject down and to try and for want of a better term, translate this into digestible language and to encourage organizations to speak to their donors, to speak to their partners, and not be afraid to challenge them if there is a clause or if there is a request that is being asked of them that they don't quite understand. So this is essentially part of something which has been happening increasingly over the last, I guess, 10 or 15 years, which is that there is an increasing professionalization of the humanitarian sector, and this is and by developing and ensuring better risk management procedures is contributing toward that continued professionalization. So finally, just a few takeaway notes that I'd like to leave you with is that at the moment we have around the world a lot of ongoing highly difficult, complex crises. In some of those, in Yemen, in Nigeria, in Syria, these are all areas where there are, according to some states, designated terrorist groups. So how can we ensure that we preserve humanitarian assistance and protection to individuals and communities in need in those states at a time when we have such complex and difficult measures, and how can we ensure that that assistance is not ultimately delayed. Ultimately, accountability across any profession, any sector is paramount, and we want to preserve that. What we just ask as a humanitarian community who are trying to be as principled as possible is that humanitarian space is preserved. We remember that for as important as it is, of course, to combat terrorism, and important as it is, of course, to take all measures to try and do that, that we do not do that to a fault whereby we're actually limiting services for communities in need. And ultimately, what we have found through our own engagements and research is the importance of having discussions around counterterrorism measures at field level. Very often we find these discussions are had at HQ level, at least in our sector, but that there is definitely a growing need to have these discussions at field level and to discuss what it means to implement counterterrorism measures, what are the expectations for stakeholders involved, and what the key points are that organisations should be aware of.
When it comes to the impact of counterterrorism measures on humanitarian action, the ICRC, of course, supports but also participates in the efforts of all colleagues from other NGOs in order really just to ensure that the counterterrorism measures taken by states and international humanitarian international organizations will take into account the work of impartial humanitarian organizations, in particular those involved in situations where non-state armed groups designated as terrorists are very active. And we are in particular very concerned by the fact that there is a growing and increasing number of counterterrorism domestic legislation that tend to criminalize any kind of support provided to non-state armed groups designated as terrorists, but also to persons designated as terrorists. And the problem is that in this legislation, this criminal legislation, the concept of support and association with, for instance, is so broadly framed that it could, and it is also encompassing the classic activities carried out by impartial humanitarian organizations such as NRC, ICRC, but also many others in situations of armed conflict. So we are actually engaged with many others in efforts in order to reach out stakeholders, in particular states, just to make sure that when they are just criminalizing any kind of support to terrorist entities, they would include in their legislation what we call the humanitarian exemption, that will make sure that the humanitarian activities carried out by impartial humanitarian actors will not fall into the scope of this very strict legislation. That's what's really the only way, in our view, just to ensure that impartial humanitarian organizations will still be able to carry out their activities in the more difficult areas, and that was just mentioned by Kate. This is in these areas where we see the most important needs for the victims of the situation at hand. So we will continue to carry out this effort. We are in particular addressing this issue at the level of the European Union, which has actually drafted a directive which is in force for the last 4 or 5 months, which includes this kind of humanitarian exemption. And now the work is really just to make sure that the member states of the EU will translate in their domestic legislation this humanitarian exemption.
Do you see your current situation? Because what I'm hearing is, on the one hand, you have this humanitarian crisis. You need to help the people. On the other hand, you have this terrorist situation, and you could be, in some ways, increasing terrorist activities. I'm looking at this from the current North Korean crisis. So the community in the world wants to help North Korea with humanitarian assistance. At the same time, there's accountability. Where is this going? Is it going to the people in need? Is it going to the leadership? So do you see the North Korean example as something you can follow or learn from?
Hands up, I'm not an expert on North Korea, but in terms of accountability, what I can say is that it goes a little bit back to what I was mentioning, albeit very briefly, about the professionalization of the sector. In the course of definitely the last 15 years, there has been increasing professionalization. And what I mean by that is much stronger accountability mechanisms and procedures in order to deliver operations. From many different sides. Accountability upwards, our donors demand it and demand accountability. And also, just to be very clear, that is a good thing. We have to be accountable, we should be accountable, and we must be transparent, 100%. So we have that accountability regardless. And it's one of the positive things, actually, of having a diversity of donors who fund operations, is that you're forced. Now, there's a whole other discussion around the amount of paperwork that generates, but we'll leave that for another day. But ultimately, it's a positive trend for better accountability. But we also have accountability on the other side. It's been a little bit slower, unfortunately, but there is there's a growing recognition and better systems now being put in place in terms of accountability to populations and accountability to communities. And there are whole work streams and innovations that are being developed to improve accountability to populations. So I could go into more detail, but I don't know if that really answers your question, because I'm not an expert in North Korea, but I'm happy to discuss afterwards.